Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. There was something about his demeanor which elicited very opposite responses.
Mm-hmm.
T.S. Eliot said he was like a living saint, and Auden said something very similar.
And Auden attributed his conversion to reading and meeting Williams.
Right. Mm-hmm. Lewis said he's a beautiful creature. I'm proud to be called his friend. But then Tolkien called him a witch doctor. And one of the Inklings meeting, Charles Wren said he should be burned at the stake.
So,
wow.
Or at least he helps us to understand why people were burned.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that's what he put
said
it.
Both,
right.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Wade podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Charles Williams for the very first time. And we're delighted to have a scholar with us, Sørina Higgins, who has published on Williams in our own Journal 7. Thank you, Sørina, for joining us today.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Crystal and David.
Since many of our listeners are not as familiar with Williams as they are with his friend C.S. Lewis, I wonder if you could just give us a background that might help them understand why Williams is significant in the life of Lewis.
Sure. I can mention a few biographical details, show how he got involved with the Inklings. Maybe we can talk about some themes in some of his works. So he was born in 1886 in London, and he was much more of a city man than the other Inklings. And he spent most of his life and career in London working for the Oxford University Press. So he was not an academic by trade, as were many of the other Inklings. He just worked in publishing. He did not actually have a college degree for financial reasons, so he was somewhat self-taught. And he worked his way up from a lowly proofreader at Oxford University Press to become one of the senior editors. So he edited many anthologies and collections and wrote introductions. So he had something to do with shaping the tastes of the times. But then in 1939, he, along with the rest of the staff there in the London office of the Oxford University Press, were evacuated to Oxford. And he and Lewis had already been corresponding for a couple of years, so then it was quite natural that he would join the Inklings for the last 6 years
And didn't the correspondence start? Didn't their letters cross in the mail?
Yes, almost.
Yeah.
Almost. Lewis wrote a
that.
fan letter to Charles Williams because Lewis had borrowed a copy of The Place of the Lion from a friend and loved it, and wrote Williams a fan letter. And while that was happening, Williams was proofreading Lewis's book, The Allegory of Love. And the title was actually suggested by Williams. Lewis had a much more boring scholarly title, and Williams suggested that better title. So he said, if you had waited 24 hours longer, I would have been writing you a letter. So he called this the staff work of the omnipotence. They were both reading and admiring each other's work at the same time.
So that means when Williams and the rest of Oxford University Press were evacuated to Oxford, Lewis and Williams were able to meet face-to-face.
They had met in London a couple of times.
Had they?
Lewis had been down there for various reasons. They'd met up for lunch and so forth, and Williams had had some business in Oxford. So they'd had a few meals together, but this is the first time they really spent a great deal of time together. And Lewis offered his rooms in Magdalen College for Williams' use, which was a great refuge because the offices of the OUP there were absolute chaos. Williams' office was a converted bathroom. He had boards over a bathtub to use for a desk, and he was staying in a very crowded house, so he didn't get much time alone. So that was a refuge to go to Lewis's rooms and drink tea there.
One of the things I learned from reading your essay in our Journal 7 was how Williams would organize performances for his staff at Oxford University Press. And it's quite humorous because today OUP just has this elevated status. And to think of all these staff members prancing around, performing strange little plays, and then poor Williams having to work off a bathtub when they were in Oxford itself.
Just
adds
a reminder
delight.
to our listeners, the bathroom in Britain is where the bathtub is. But
Right.
not necessarily
Oh, yeah,
the
that's
toilet.
true.
Closet.
People have this image of
that
him
was-
sitting on the toilet and somebody knocks us. Could you excuse me a minute? I need to, So it was the room where the bathtub
That's
was.
right.
Okay. Just clear that up for our listeners.
Okay, let's go back to his living in Oxford now.
Sure. So it was just the last 6 years of his life. So it's important to note that even though he was an essential member of the Inklings, it was only for that brief period. So he was mostly formed as a writer, although he said the Inklings were good for his mind. He had rarely met people with whom he could have conversations really on the same level, and who could quote literature back at him and could challenge his logic and so forth. So they were very good for him, for his writing, for his theology, and so forth.
Mm.
He got there was something about his demeanor which elicited very opposite responses.
Mm-hmm.
T.S. Eliot said he was like a living saint, and Auden said something very similar.
And Auden attributed his conversion to reading and meeting Williams.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Lewis said he's a beautiful creature. I'm proud to be called his friend. But then Tolkien called him a witch doctor. And one of the Inklings meeting, Charles Wren said he should be burned at the stake. So,
wow.
Or at least he helps us to understand why people were burned.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that's what he put it.
Both,
right.
Yeah. And even Lewis, who seemingly was really overwhelmed by Williams and was just delighted to be friends with him, he said that he resembles a monkey, but that when he smiles, his face is transformed into that of an angel.
Mm.
Right.
So Williams had this very strange charisma about him that people were very drawn to him. And I believe Tolkien even was too. The more critical things Tolkien said were later in life, when his letters were getting generally a bit grumpier as well.
Right.
But maybe he knew a bit more about Williams then. At the time, there are delightful letters from Tolkien about meeting up with Williams for dinner and having lovely conversations. Unfortunately, though, Tolkien was right to some extent. Williams was, if not a witch doctor, at least a very high adept in occult secret societies. He was a practitioner of various kinds of magic. He was master of a temple in a secret society for 3 different time periods, and possibly an initiate in another order. There's a little bit of evidence that Greville Lindup suggests he was maybe an initiate in a second magical order for 20 years. And exploring and practicing things on the edge of the paranormal and certainly beyond orthodoxy.
Mm. Well, when you read his novels, you say, where does he get this stuff?
Right.
And since this new biography came out, we go, oh, that's where I got that stuff.
Right.
But didn't he more or less hide that from the Inklings? It doesn't seem like they knew that much about that side of him.
Only very little. I don't think that they knew anything like the extent of it. They knew that he had some experience with some kind of an occult society. Lewis does say somewhere that Williams had some firsthand knowledge of the rituals and things that he describes. I don't think they knew anything of the sexualized nature of it. There's a lovely and unfortunately completely incorrect line in Lewis's preface to Essays Presented to Charles Williams, in which he says something like, Williams had a great effect on everyone he met, men and women alike, and women would readily fall in love with him. If he had been a bad man, he could have done what he liked as either a Don Juan or a charlatan. And unfortunately, he was doing quite a good deal quite a bad deal as a Don Juan. We didn't get into his unconsummated but definitely sexual extramarital affair that carried on for decades and so forth. So I don't think the Inklings knew anything about that, but they knew that he had looked into the depths of some of the darker sides of spirituality with which they would be extremely uncomfortable. The very active period of his life was just 10 years from 1917 to 1927 when he was in the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross. So that was done by the time he moved to Oxford. And
could you just mention that they're not the ones that sell Girl Scout cookies, right?
That's right.
Could you mention what their mission was or their...
Yes. They were founded in England in 1888 by a group of former Masons who were trying to search the world for the original rituals. They could find sort of these ancient rituals that communicated a secret tradition. They had a big split in 1903. This was the Order of the Golden Dawn, and then they split into several branches, one of which was William Butler Yeats, and that was the more magical branch. Another was Aleister Crowley, which was the black magic branch. And then there was a third one led by A.E. Waite that was the Christian mystical branch of this, and that's the one that Charles Williams joined. So A.E. Waite believed that Christianity had both the exoteric, which is the public side, and the esoteric, which is the secret side. So he thought anyone could access the scripture and Christian tradition, but there was also a secret oral tradition that had been passed down from ancient times, and only a few initiates knew this secret tradition. So that's the branch that Charles Williams was in, and he would have learned Kabbalistic mysticism, he would have meditated on the tarot and on astrology and so forth. So as I say, he left that order in 1927, probably just because he finished it, because he rose all the way through the ranks and learned all there was to learn. But then if Greville Lindup is correct, there was this other group that continued for another 20 years. Now, why did he hide it from the Inklings? Well, there were secret societies. He took vows of secrecy.
Oh, right.
So he couldn't tell them explicitly. I'm not sure with the one he had left whether that gave him any leeway or not. But he probably knew they wouldn't completely understand. He may have even been struggling himself with whether this was 100% reconcilable with his Christian faith. That seems to be the case in the last novel, All Hallows' Eve. That's the novel in which magic seems to be completely repudiated and the sorcerer is the bad guy, as opposed to the first novel, Shadows of Ecstasy, in which the sorcerer is a very appealing figure, and that's a highly ambiguous and troubling novel.
Well, Eliot's famous phrase that Christ is the still point in the turning world, he said he got from Williams, and it had something to do with tarot?
It does. So he got that from Williams' novel, The Greater Trumps. And in that novel, there are two sets of magical items. There's a set of tarot cards that are said in the novel to be the original set, from which all others are derived. But then they also correspond to a set of golden figurines that look sort of like chessmen that are eternally moving in a complicated dance, which also, by the way, is very like the Great Dance at the end of C.S. Lewis's Perelandra. But the unique feature in The Greater Trumps is that there's a figure called the Fool who stands in the middle of this board of golden figurines and does not move. And so it seems that maybe he is the inspiration for the still point of the turning world. However, those who have mystical vision see the Fool moving and participating in the dance. So it's sort of a beautiful image of how God, or Christ specifically, is the center of all things around which they turn, but also is a figure in the dance and participates in it as well.
Side note, neither Wheaton College nor the Wade Center endorses the use of tarot cards in one's spiritual journey.
Right. Or secret societies. In fact, the Blanchard, who founded Wheaton College, actually took a stand not only against slavery. So Blanchard was an abolitionist, but he also wanted to abolish secret societies.
That's fascinating. There must have been some cultural history with that he'd had some encounters that had concerned him.
Well, the trouble with this type of approach to Christianity, where there is a secret code to the Bible, is it does not allow for openness. Right. Whereas the whole point of Christ's mission is that all are welcome to salvation, to reconciliation with God. And so the whole secret element applies well. There's special knowledge some of us have. And there's always this human attraction to that type of enticing special knowledge.
There is. And Williams connected it with his theories of the poet. The poet was sort of a prophet seer that had this special knowledge. So it is Gnostic in the sense of having hidden knowledge, you're right. But it is Williams's version is not Gnostic in the sense that he embraces the body and materiality. Right. He called himself a poet of affirmation. So he does not reject materialism the way Gnosticism would. But as Aaron Rukma has shown in his article and also in his recent book on the novels, the members of the secret societies had this delicate balance that on the one hand, they couldn't violate their vows of secrecy, as I said, or else, interestingly, they would be blasted with rods of black lightning, which is what happens to the guy who tries to steal the stone in Many Dimensions. That's a side note on that. But on the other hand, they were also supposed to create artistic works and systems of symbolism that could communicate the truths to the uninitiated in a way that the uninitiated could handle, so that it didn't have any secret information in it, but somehow they still got the spiritual truths. So
that was part of his assignment. I was reading your essay.
Right.
And part of his assignment from the society is to find images to make the message accessible to a broader audience.
And it's an image of hierarchy. It's an image of immanence. It emphasizes immanence as opposed to transcendence. And Williams actually takes that quite far. He actually pushes our participation in the Godhead to an extreme degree that most Protestants would not be comfortable with. So he emphasizes those, and he emphasizes the majesty and beauty and the ordered nature of the universe. Everything has to do with patterns. Everything is layered together.
That's very Neoplatonic.
Yes, it is.
Neoplatonism was an influence on Freemasonry, which was looking for symbolism, going back to not just the pyramids, but the Tower of Babel,
right,
to the temple in Jerusalem, where even the dimensions had symbolic power. And of course, the Kabbalah perpetuates that idea.
Mm-hmm.
The question then is this tension between secret societies versus, as David just mentions, opening it up to more people.
Right.
So I wonder how they negotiated that.
Mm-hmm. And really the answer, I think, is through the imagination and through the arts, primarily through written word, through poetry, novels, plays, and so forth. So I think that's what Williams is doing in a lot of his poetry, plays, novels. Really, I think everything except the nonfiction works. He's trying to portray this sort of deeper and secret truths in symbolic ways that will sort of sink into our subconscious. It's a little bit like the way Michael Ward discusses what he believes the Planet Narnia idea with the 7 symbols, that we don't need to know that to appreciate the Narnia Chronicles. What happens is we just come to love these symbols, these colors, this imagery, and so forth. And in that case, in the case of C.S. Lewis, we then come to love Christ better under these 7 images or emblems of Aslan. So then coming back to Charles Williams, you don't need to know anything about the esoteric or the occult to appreciate the imagery in his poetry and in his fiction. But it may help baptize your imagination in a sense, or deepen your imagination, help you appreciate different facets of God better through this imagery and this symbolism.
Well, he was amazingly prolific. He wrote novels, poetry, plays, essays, surveys of Christian church history,
biographies, literary criticism.
If someone was interested in Williams and you wanted to get them started, what titles would you steer them toward?
It's such a great question. And I actually do have a reader's guide for beginners on the Oddest Inkling website, so that they can check that out there. And I would say that depends what someone's favorite genre is. Probably the largest number of readers would go for fiction first. So my favorite novel is The Place of the Lion. That's an okay place to start. But readers might want to start with War in Heaven, because it has something most clearly resembling a plot of all of the works.
Right.
And it starts out just like a murder mystery, and then it turns into a wild chase for the Holy Grail. It's delightful. So maybe start there. War in Heaven, Many Dimensions, Place of the Lion. But then his poetry is just beautiful. It's very complicated, but it has this sort of sensory musicality to it that you can appreciate even if you're not quite getting all of the details.
You said in your essay that Williams was the most accomplished poet of the Inklings.
I think so.
And in some ways, I would say that's not a very high bar.
Right. Alas.
Although I love Tom Bombadillo. Somebody said that the most read poet in the 20th century is Tolkien, because he sold 100 million copies of Lord of the Rings. Right. And there's all the poetry.
But how many readers read the poetry?
Right.
I came back and said, well, 99 million of them skipped the poetry. This goes to the question, what would you tell someone? The poetry is pretty opaque, and even the other Inklings,
struggled with it.
Yeah, struggled with it and told him to try to be more clear. What would you say to someone who said, I tried Williams and I just didn't get it? What would you say is the payoff for really grappling with the text and feeling it's a rewarding experience?
Yes. Oh, let's see. There are so many payoffs. There's just the aesthetic value of the poetry, just reading it aloud and enjoying the sounds and the lilt and the rhythms and all that the first time. The images are very powerful. It's beautiful descriptions of the Byzantine Empire and of the heraldic imagery on the shields and banners of the Knights of the Round Table. There's also some beautiful characterization. Now, that's not what Williams is well known for. A lot of his critics say he doesn't know how to write characters. They're very flat or they're very allegorical. And indeed, their functions tend to be more important than the figures themselves, the people themselves. However, he does give these profound little insights into the characters he's writing about, whether it's Guinevere or Lancelot, Percival, whomever else. And then there's the pattern. There's this unfolding pattern in his Arthurian poetry that rewards rereading and seeing how the threads weave together. So there's that intellectual pleasure as well.
That's somewhat ironic then in terms of his philosophy about embodiment, when his characters don't feel like fully enfleshed characters.
Yes.
They are symbols for something else, if not placeholders to move the narrative forward.
Yep, that is definitely a problem. And that was a problem not only in his writing, but in his life too. Because everything we're talking about, he also endeavored to live out and to make everyone with whom he came in touch live out these patterns and these theories, these theologies of life. So for instance, there was one young woman with whom he had a rather troubling relationship. And at one stage, she accused him exactly of that, of saying that he wasn't treating her like a real person. And she was criticizing his theories of love, his theories of substitution and so forth. And he said, well, what else is there? And she said, a real relationship with a real person? And he was just stunned. He just kind of looked at her and he didn't know what that was. And he knew this problem about himself. He characterizes his poet Taliesin, who was kind of an alter ego, as being neither fish nor flesh, as being someone that no woman would ever want to be with, and being sort of a strange creature who's not really a part of this world. So he struggled with that. And even though he was the poet of affirmation, he said he was characterologically more drawn to negation. And when he first fell in love with Florence Conway, he wrote her a long cycle of sonnets about giving up, about rejection, and about celibacy and self-denial and so forth. When she first read it, she said, is he going to join a monastery? And then she reread them and realized, oh, they're about me. And then they were engaged for 9 years before they got married. So this was definitely a tension in his own life.
Somewhere she said on their first meeting, for the first 5 minutes, he was the quietest person I ever met. And for the rest of the evening, he was the most talkative person I ever met.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. He must have been an introvert there once. Although he was so charismatic, he would teach these classes in London and people would have questions. They say, oh, let's go to the pub down the street and continue this discussion. So he had quite a cult following just as a lecturer.
Absolutely. He definitely did. And he certainly had the flow of words. Once he got going, it just had almost flight of speech or pressured speaking. And apparently he would walk around jingling coins in his pockets and just quoting huge swaths of English poetry of Dante and talking nonstop.
Somebody said, excuse me, I was just going to say, someone said he was so animated that sometimes you'd hear a dog barking next door because they felt something exciting was going on.
Because he was disturbing the energies of the universe.
Exactly.
Well, it's interesting, this comment you just made about how people love to hear him talk, because I was just going to ask you about his concept of coherence, which fascinates me on several levels. First, I think that's one way that he really influenced C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
And second, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, of course, is the person who coined the word coherence. And Coleridge is famous for attracting people who just loved to hear him talk, whereas his actual literary output, it was not as impressive as his talk.
Right. And yeah, let's talk about coherence for a minute. It's almost a translation of the concept of the perichoresis, the theological idea of the three members of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in this eternal dance with one another. So it's this idea of beings interacting in extremely tight unity. It also can be related to the concept of Christ's incarnation, that he has these two natures always together in union. And then from that, Williams extrapolated that all people are unified with one another in a very, very tight bond, and that everything we do is a matter of exchange between one another. So from coherence, which is sort of the theological foundation, he then built this doctrine of the way of exchange or substitution, which is the idea that not only can I help you out in ordinary physical ways, but I can also help you out in spiritual ways. So for instance, Crystal, let's say you're carrying something, you've been carrying it too long and it's now too heavy for you. I could just say, here, can I carry that box for you? And that's a normal physical type of exchange. But Williams believed that suppose you were suffering from a huge grief or a terror or a disease even, I could offer to carry that, and I could substitute myself for you and take on that emotional, spiritual, or even medical burden. And late in his life, Williams even founded a group called the Companions of Coherence, or the Order of Coherence, in which he assigned the members various burdens to carry for one another and for others. So he believed this as a literal theological teaching. He said that it was biblical, and he told his disciples to practice it.
This, once again, was an influence on Lewis.
It was.
He someone wrote him about that, and he said, I will not criticize the concept. Wrote Lewis about coherence. And he said, I will not speak against the concept. Christ said to Paul on the road to Damascus, why, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me, rather than why do you persecute my followers?
Right.
So Lewis mentioned that verse, and then later on when Joy Davidman had the bone marrow from her cancer being eaten away, he prayed that he could take some of that pain from the dissolving of her bones. And sure enough, her bones started mending, but then he started developing... What's that? Osteoporosis.
Losing the calcium in his bones.
My comment would always be, why does it have to go somewhere? Why can't it just be healed? Why would it have to go to C.S. Lewis?
And he wrote in a letter, one would like to suspect a Charles Williams substitution, but maybe this is where you were going to go. I know some sort of modern followers of Charles Williams. There was a chat room. It was one of those Yahoo groups that was called the Coherence Net, which was delightful. And people would actually share in there their stories of trying to exchange. And the story that struck me the most ended with the woman saying, and I felt Christ take it and carry it for me. And that makes more sense to me.
Right.
And with your question of why does it have to go somewhere? Because if it just comes to me, well, I'm no stronger than you. So why should I be able to carry what you can't carry? But if the idea is that it then gets passed along to Christ, that makes sense. I'm not sure Williams ever says that. He certainly does not in his clearest statement of it, which is in the novel Descent into Hell, when a character explains it to another. And he says, you can leave Christ out of it if you want.
Well, a student of mine once said, now, could you explain to me incoherence? I didn't quite understand that. That's a whole different problem. That's more of a student writing problem. Another concept that Lewis definitely borrowed from from Williams was the idea of logos in That Hideous Strength.
Yep.
There's the idea of logos versus Britain, and it's almost the city of God versus the city of man.
Right.
But I'm sure he got that concept from Taliesin through logos.
And they are two places co-inhering in one another. Now, I think Lewis actually expresses it much more clearly than Williams when Lewis glosses it that there are those two kingdoms. And he goes on to say that this is not an ethnocentric concept, that every kingdom has its earthly struggles and its wars and so forth, and then the kingdom of God trying to break in and establish peace and harmony. In Williams, it's more that Logres is a province of the Byzantine Empire, which is an amalgamation of the Roman and the Byzantine empires. Williams wrote the East-West schism of the church out of his history, and he conflated 1,000 years of history in his Arthurian poetry. So he has a unified church, and he has a unified Roman-Byzantine empire, of which England is a province, which it never was of the Byzantine Empire. So it's something larger in Williams, I think, than it is in Lewis. And again, it has to do with order and patterning. And this is his theology of the city. Here it's the city writ large, the size of an empire. But that was his view of heaven, was that heaven was an orderly city in which everything had its place and everything was serving its proper function.
Did he read any famous theologians, or did he get most of his, what is called his romantic theology, from his secret society peers?
All of the above. He read everything. It's never safe to assume there was anything that he hadn't read. So he'd read all of the great theologians, the patristic writers, the classics, medieval writers, and so forth. There's one aspect that he probably got from his secret society, which is the idea of the transmutation of energies into another channel. So he learned to practice some kind of transmutation of sexual energy into creative energy and into devotion. So, that he probably didn't get from Augustine.
Right. It sounds much more like the courtly love tradition.
Yes.
That precedes Arthurian romance. And so he is emphasizing and idealizing, and to a certain extent in idealizing, objectifying woman as the inspiration and source for great achievement.
That's right. And those first two letters that he and Lewis wrote to each other started an argument about the nature of courtly love and about Williams's interpretation of it. And Lewis said straight up that he was not comfortable with this identification of romantic love with Christian devotion, that Lewis saw it as idolatry and Williams saw it as the way of devotion, that the way to know and love God was, in his case, to love, idolize, objectify a woman, or at least his image of a woman.
Is this figure of Beatrice, is that the book you're talking about?
That came later, but yes, that was the result of all of this. An early one was Outlines of Romantic Theology.
Oh, right.
Which didn't get published.
That's a very exotic pickup line. That would be an interesting...
Absolutely. He was one of those.
Sayers was fascinated with the figure of Beatrice. Yes. That's what started...
Inspired her to...
Yes, this... powerful correspondence between Williams and Sayers, and got her really interested in Dante, so that she got the contract to translate Dante for Penguin Books. So Williams was really important, or at least that book was important for her.
Absolutely.
He wished he'd written an autobiography, because he knew Eliot, Auden, all the Inklings, Sayers. I'm leaving one. Evelyn Underhill, the great writer on mysticism. He edited her letters. And I would have loved to hear
Yates. He was in
Yates.
With Yates. And he knew a lot of the younger up-and-coming poets, too. The Philip Larkin generation as well really looked up to him and admired him. Well, if he hadn't died suddenly at that age, 1 week after the end of World War II in Europe, he was planning to teach at Oxford and to retire and to reconcile with his somewhat estranged wife at that point and to settle down and write his great works. And he probably would have written something about that.
This new biography by Greville Lindop, we touched on this, the occultism and the feeling of emotional boundaries not being respected with women.
Absolutely.
Did you find that disturbing, or did you find that more or less... could you speak to that? I mean... Yes.
Now, we knew a little bit about that before Lindop's biography because of one important little book called Letters to Lalage, which is a correspondence... We only have Lewis's side of it, but a correspondence between Williams and a young lady named Lois Lang Sims. And this was the one I referred to previously, as she accused him of not having real human relationships. So Williams frequently formed these intense emotional master-disciple relationships with younger women. And then he would practice rituals on these girls that were designed to get his creative juices flowing. And he said that it was necessary for the poetry. But he never, in our contemporary terms, received informed consent. He never told them what he was doing and what it was for. And it was very mysterious and very disturbing to them that he would perform these unknown rituals. And it seems that Lois Lang Sims is the only one who pushed back against this. But it was only after he had caused her so much emotional damage that she had a 6-month breakdown, mental and emotional and physical breakdown. She became extremely ill. She was bedridden for a time. She was just incapable of functioning for 6 months because of what he had done to her emotionally and spiritually. So I would call it sexual, emotional, and spiritual abuse that he was doing to these women.
So do you see it as a Jekyll-Hyde personality, considering Eliot and Auden comparing him to a saint, and then he has this secret life? Or is it because it's so much a part of his philosophy that, yes, of course, you have secret initiation rites, that is
the latter.
How you function? Okay.
The latter. I don't see it as a Jekyll and Hyde. I see his characters being very consistent, very unified. Now, not everyone saw all of it, but what they saw was just some degree along the trajectory. So everyone saw the compelling charisma, the saintliness, the love pouring out of him towards other people. And he did make people feel wonderful around him. He transformed them. You would say something sort of stumbling and kind of dumb, and he would repeat it back to you. It made you sound brilliant. And so you felt so smart and beautiful and intelligent in his company. But then, the next step along the trajectory would be casting you in a play to perform when you didn't really know what the role in the play was and you weren't totally informed. And then the next step along that would be these rituals and so forth. But my work now, I'm studying magic. I'm studying those occult secret societies, including the one he was initiated in. And one of the aspects that I'm looking at is how liable it is to abuse. Because the appeal of these, of course, is that they offer power.
Yes.
Or at least, say that they offer power. And I would say that was Charles Williams's personal biggest weakness or temptation, was a desire for power, a desire for control. And this offered it to him. And so, of course, along with any kind of power comes the potential to abuse it.
Right. Almost every one of his novels has that theme somewhere embedded in it.
Absolutely.
I would agree. He also had this wonderful synthetic mind. He would see a a patrolman holding his hand out to tell an automobile to halt. And he says, "Oh, that's like Charlemagne." Immediately he would see the authority of a bobby and connect that to the authority of the great emperor. Legendary figure. Mm-hmm. I always wonder in Tolkien if that gesture, it's not in the Lord of the Rings, but in a draft, Tom Bombadil sees the ring race following them on horses, and he turns around and holds out his hand, and he has such kind of power that they disperse. And then later on, when you're going down the river Anjou and you see those two great Argonath, these figures holding out their hand.
Their warning hands.
And it's probably too speculative, but I always wonder if Tolkien heard that remark about the authority in holding out your hand, and if he might have translated that.
He may have, because that was from the Greater Trumps, which is 1932, so he certainly would have had a chance to read that. Now, that was written before Williams joined the Inklings, so he wouldn't have heard it in draft. But it's certainly the kind of idea that would have come up in conversation. But I suspect it's more like Williams was drawing significance out of the age-old figure. And Tolkien is drawing on the age-old figure as well.
Right.
So not necessarily that Tolkien heard Williams talking about the deeper significance, but that Tolkien himself is reaching back to the same archetypes that Williams then says he's interpreting.
Because I think I just heard Tolkien and Lewis turning over in their graves and going, "They're doing it again." It's all this speculative source criticism.
Exactly.
I believe your approach is probably much sounder.
Well, thank you. They're all drawing on archetypes, and they're all drawing on the myths that continue to resonate over and over and over again. But then Williams has this added layer or many layers. And another interesting difference between Williams and the others is that all of his novels are set in the modern world. They're not set in some other secondary world like Narnia or some pre-modern version of the world like Middle Earth. They're set in the center of London or in rural or suburban England, and the supernatural forces break in or break through into our own world.
I'm talking about that this evening. Tolkien tended to like what they call immersion fantasies. The very first sentence is, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit."
Right.
We're not getting there from Earth. We're not traveling. There's no portal. Whereas Lewis liked portal fantasies. You start out on Earth and then the wardrobe takes you somewhere, or the spaceship takes you somewhere.
Or a painting takes you somewhere.
And Williams tended to like what they call intrusion fantasies, where something from the secondary world of the perilous realm breaks in on Earth. And as I was looking at this, Lewis's only novel, which isn't a portal fantasy, is That Hideous Strength, where these evil forces intrude upon life at Nice. And I'm wondering, but people talk about That Hideous Strength being a Charles Williams novel by C.S. Lewis.
Right. And of course, Till We Have Faces is its own completely sealed secondary world. You have neither intrusion nor immersion. It's complete. And I think that's one reason it's his best work of fiction, is that it's its own mythopoeia from beginning to end.
I would agree. And also his characters are more well-rounded.
Oh, yes.
He had a tendency to make it very easy to spot the heroes and the villains in his earlier novels. And that Till We Have Faces, I love the self-realization when O'Rule realizes that she's really not the hero of this tale. In many ways, she's the villainess of the tale.
Right. And of course, it's his best female character, his only real female character, really, thanks to Joy's influence.
Right. You are here studying at the Wade, doing research for your dissertation, I assume. What are you looking for?
Today, I am looking at several fragments and unpublished bits of plays by Charles Williams, because I mentioned I'm working on drama, plays written between 1890 and 1945 by British and Irish magicians, who were also playwrights. And I was surprised to find in the catalog how many fragments there still are, how many unpublished pieces. So I've discovered 13 playwrights who fit into that designation, who are both magicians and writing dramas in that period. And none of them, not one, yet has a complete plays edition, including T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats. Now, the Eliot one is in preparation right now. We'll soon have a complete plays. The Yeats, there's a good collected, but it's not complete. And the Charles Williams collected plays is by no means complete. There have been many others discovered since John Heath Stubbs' lovely edition, but there's more work to do.
When you say they're all magicians, you're saying they were all able to saw a woman in half?
That's right, and levitate and pull rabbits out of hats. No stage magic here. This is all real magic.
Yeah, could you give us a quick definition of magic as you're using it?
Sure. I'm not talking about that kind of stage illusion of sawing people in half, levitating, pulling rabbits out of hats. None of that. It's difficult to define, but primarily what these people were practicing was some kind of psychological change in themselves. They were seeking enlightenment. Now, some of them were trying to effect the exterior world to some degree. Yeats infamously tried to resurrect the ghost of a rose from its dead petals, which got him kicked out of the Theosophical Society. And they did do some things like shared dreaming, telepathy, astral travel, things like that. But primarily they were just trying to affect their own psychology, their own spiritual state, to rewire their cognitive processes, probably. And this is what they meant by alchemy. They were looking for the transmutation not of lead into gold, but of the soul's baser instincts into the soul's higher instincts. So I've often been asked, do you believe that their magic worked? Well, any practice that you do on a regular basis rewires your mind. If you pray every morning or do yoga every morning or memorize a lot of poetry, that rewires your brain. So certainly the fact that they were spending years of intense study memorizing rituals and reciting things and practicing, it certainly worked to do something to their brains. I don't claim to know what was actually happening metaphysically, whether they were in touch with demons or angels or anything like that. Although at the very end of his life, William Butler Yeats did say, I think we were only in touch with the best part of our own imaginations. But there was something going on in their minds, and their goal was to get in touch with higher spiritual planes. They were all initiates in these hermetic secret societies.
In academia, that's called a Ph.D., by the way.
Exactly. Well, and honestly, I think one reason for the occult revival in this time period that I was studying is that it was an alternative means of education for people who were not part of the university system. So people like Charles Williams and William Butler Yeats were not Oxbridge educated. And, Williams, I mentioned, did not have enough money to finish even a bachelor's degree. So these secret societies gave very rigorous intellectual training. It was years of reading, studying, learning languages, memorizing complicated systems of symbolism. And by the way, they were gender equal. Women were initiated into these, and they had not been in the Masons. Women were able to have very high positions of leadership. So I think these were a way for working class and lower middle class people to get a kind of a rigorous intellectual training that they couldn't have in the mainstream academic system. And that offered them a kind of cultural currency, a kind of intellectual power that they wouldn't necessarily have otherwise, as well as the spirituality and the lure of secrets and so forth.
Fascinating.
Can I segue a bit to your collection of essays on Arthurian lore among the Inklings?
Certainly.
What gave you that idea? What were some of the challenges and some of the satisfactions of that project? This just came out recently, and it's quite a thick volume, quality and quantity. It's a lot of reading, but it's a lot of eminent scholars and pundits and mavens and mavens and other experts. Tell us a little bit about that project.
Sure. Well, the direct inspiration was the publication in 2013 of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Fall of Arthur. So when that book came out, we suddenly knew, each of the three major Inklings had a significant Arthurian work. I didn't know at the time whether Barfield had any. I discovered afterwards that he had a few small Arthurian works. So that was the inspiration, was, Tolkien has this Arthurian work, so now there needs to be new work done on the Inklings and King Arthur, because nothing had been done for over 30 years since a collection considering just Williams Lewis and T.S. Eliot's Arthuriana by Charles Moorman. So that seemed obvious, and I was chatting with Brenton Dickinson, who has often come here to research at the Wade, and I said, somebody needs to edit a volume like that, and he said, you do. Or he said, somebody needs to edit a volume like that, and I said, I do. I don't remember which way it went. But got on that project, and the greatest satisfaction of the project was working with those 20, actually, because there's a co-written chapter, 20 wonderful scholars. As you said, both established scholars, but also emerging voices, people who perhaps do something else, and this was their first scholarly project. I love how varied the work is, the different voices in the chapter. People from the United States and from Europe, and people of all ages and different theoretical perspectives. And
really in depth, too. You could spend a lot of time with that book.
Yes.
Excellent scholarship.
Thank you. I was glad to get chapters that are big survey overviews, sort of flyovers, and then chapters that dig very deeply into just one text. The frustrations were largely what you would expect, the logistical type of ones with a project of that size. There are things I would do differently now with technology to make collaboration easier, because it was a little bit difficult with people all over the world with different drafts and documents and timelines and so forth, bringing that all together, the editing, the permissions for the quotations and things like that. But, no unusual challenges for a project of that size.
Well, Lewis had the same feeling when he tried to put together his collection of essays in honor of Charles Williams after he passed. There's a lot of letters he's trying to write T.S. Eliot. Please give me your submission.
It's so sad that we don't have a submission from Eliot in that collection. That would really just make it complete.
Yeah, I was doing a project for a while on Lewis and Eliot. I'd like to get back to it. But I started noticing the people that knew them both, like Charles Williams, Dorothy Sayers. There's a fellow named William Forstead. And it's, in some ways, you sort of have to choose between the Lewis camp, sort of anti-modernist, and the Eliot camp. But those who went back and forth, they were comfortable in London and they were comfortable in Oxford. I think in many ways, the secret to being friends of both of them was that you could, thrive in London, but you could go to Oxford and thrive in.
Oh, that's good.
So
that's a good insight. And Williams was that rare figure who was able to function in both circles. He considered T.S. Eliot one of his best friends, and then he considered C.S. Lewis one of his best friends. And he was able to pop back and forth between those worlds. And he wrote the mythopoeic fantasy spiritual literature, but he also wrote somewhat modernist poetry.
Right.
And his poetry is by no means as good as Eliot's from a technical point of view. But as we already mentioned, it's a step above the other Inklings. And I think it's because he was listening to the modern voices as well as the earlier voices.
But he was so versatile. He also wrote these fairly thin surveys. He came down from heaven and Descent of the Dove, which are really a good introduction to theology and church history and very wittily written.
Right.
So we've already mentioned about 10 titles that are sort of must-reads. But did you want to say anything about Chapel of the Thorn?
Right. So Chapel of the Thorn is another work that I discovered here in the Wade's collection. Now, I had known of its existence.
Can we put a reverb on that? I discovered it here in the Wade collection. Wade. Okay, excuse me, Sørina. I keep interrupting.
No problem.
Bingo!
Well, one of the earliest people to write about Charles Williams, Alice Mary Hadfield, says that it was lost. Well, it wasn't lost. It was here all along. So I came here to read it in 2012, and I thought I was just going to read it and move on. But I read it and thought, this is too good to just move on. It's not a magnificent play, but it is playable. I have done a semi-dramatic reading of it with the theater group, and it does read really well. And a theater director who was there said that she thinks it could be staged. But anyway, this is a very early work of Charles Williams from 1912. And it's just a 2-act play without a whole lot of action in it. It's quite philosophical, as his works tend to be. But there is a dramatic conflict. There's a chapel that holds either the crown of thorns or some piece thereof. Might be only one thorn, but some relic from Christ's Passion. And there are 3 groups who are vying for possession of this. There's the little local chapel. The priest wants to keep it there. There's the big cathedral down the road, wants to take it and move it there to get more pilgrims and thus more donations. And then there are the local druids, because one of their quasi-divine figures is buried right underneath the chapel. And they are happy with the Christians keeping the chapel, because then no one else will get at their site, and their site won't be bulldozed or anything. Anachronism. So these 3 groups are competing for it. And what's fascinating about this early work is that Williams leaves it ambiguous at the end. He doesn't really take sides among these vying spiritual groups. And there's a poet bard figure in it who's a pagan priest who seems to be the character who might have Williams' sympathies. And it was, by the way, very like an early Yeats character, a bard named Alil in The Countess Kathleen. So there's this sort of Celtic druidic figure who seems maybe to have Williams' sympathies.
What is his faith journey? Did he grow up in a Christian home?
He did, yes. His parents were Anglicans. He was baptized at a young age and raised in the faith. His father was an interesting character who would take him for long walks and talk to him about theology and philosophy, but would always make him switch sides of the discussion halfway through and try out both sides of every idea. And that stuck with him all his life. I have seen no evidence of any kind of conversion moment or strong rededication moment in Williams. His faith seems to have been there all his life, but always with doubt and questioning and skepticism as essential parts of his faith.
Mm-hmm.
He was very drawn to the works of Søren Kierkegaard, which he actually introduced to an English audience. He edited the first English editions, and he may have been the first person in England to lecture on Kierkegaard's works.
Sometimes individual quotes of his. One of my favorite quotations of Williams, he says, "Sin is choosing immediate gratification over the acknowledged pattern of the universe."
Mm-hmm.
And so somewhere in your brain, you know that this is not the right choice, but you want to have that immediate gratification. I think that's a really thoughtful definition of sin.
It is. And it goes together with what the playwright says in Descent into Hell when he's describing coherence in the way of exchange. And he says, I can't help it. I didn't make the universe, but that's just the way it is. So Williams thought of what we might call Christian morals or virtues as simply being conformity to the nature of things. Admitting the way things are and submitting oneself to that. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, Sørina. This has been fascinating. I have learned a lot.
And me as well. Thank you so much.
This has been utterly delightful.
You're so articulate. You're such a great spokesperson to make people want to dig into Williams and the other Inklings in their Arthurian works.
With some caveat lector along the way. There's some warnings of what you might be getting yourself into. But thank you. It's great to have this chance to talk to you both.
Thanks for coming.